And not only that.
Everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started since it's 11:30. Thanks everybody for being here for another meeting of the Anthropology Department's Pro Seminar Series. Today, our speaker is Dr. Joe Quick, who is joining us as a new member of our faculty. Just joined us in the fall as a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology here at UNLV, teaching courses in cultural anthropology. So if you happen to know any undergraduates who are looking for classes in the spring, look no further. There will be other cultural anthropology classes offered. So spread the word if you haven't already done so. So just a little bit here at the outset to introduce our speaker. Dr. Quick completed his MA and PhD in anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, those in 2012 and 2018. Since completing his graduate studies, Dr. Quick has served as a teaching faculty member at a number of institutions, including Governor State University and his alma mater, University of Wisconsin. More recently, before coming to join us here at UNLV, he was a research associate in the Department of Modern Languages and Culture at the University of Manchester. Dr. Quick's research focuses on the contemporary faces of Indigenous experience in the Americas. Anchored in Latin America, his work explores the institutions of Indigenous civil society in Ecuador, the labor migration of Kichwa people from Ecuador to the United States, and the use of social media by young Kichwa creators from Ecuador and young Mapuche creators from Argentina and Chile. This research and related projects have appeared in journals such as Latin American Research Review and Canadian Journal of Development Studies, and edited volumes including the Handbook of Eco-Cultural Identity and Front and Backstage of Tourism Performance, Imaginaries, and Bucket List Venues. He has a number of forthcoming publications, including an article in a special issue of Tourist Studies. So needless to say, Dr. Quick is very busy. Therefore, we are all the more appreciative of having him here with us at UNLV as a colleague and as a speaker today for our Pro Seminars series. The talk today is titled Kichwa Visions, Ethnography of/through Indigenous Artistic Critiques of Political Economy in Highland, Ecuador. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Quick.
The Tourist Studies article was supposed to be live on their website today. But they used AI to do the references section and made a whole mess of it. So hopefully later this week, but it'll be officially published in December. All right, so what I want to talk about here today is really just one part of my research. We're going to leave out all that social media stuff. We're going to leave out Argentina and Chile and Colombia and these other places. We're going to leave out most references to migrants in the United States because just talking about tourist art, I already have more slides than minutes here. And so we're going to pull on sort of three publications that are in different stages of development. And the primary thing here is a special edited volume in honor of Nelson Grayburn, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of California at Berkeley, and one of the pioneers in the anthropology of tourism. So I've been involved with the Anthropology of Tourism Interest Group for many years now. That's part of the American Anthropological Association. And there's been an effort to put out special edited volumes in honor of each of the sort of founding heroes. We've been talking for a while about putting together a volume in honor of Nelson, but about a month, maybe 6 weeks ago, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And so there is now like an extreme rush on to get this sort of put together before, well, in time for him to read it and appreciate it. He told us when the volume in honor of another of his longtime colleagues and friends, when that was published after that colleague's death, Nelson said, "Don't you dare do that for my volume." So we're going quickly, and I'm going to basically follow what I'm writing for that volume here. Most of the contributors to the book will have been Nelson's students at some point. I was never his student. Most others will have been co-authors with him at some point. I never wrote anything with him. They brought me in mainly because most of the folks who were trained by Nelson or directly influenced by Nelson, who work in the field of anthropology of tourism, have not followed his lead in studying tourist-oriented art. And I think the reason for that ultimately comes from sort of two different directions that one could go from this statement here, which comes from an article in 1969, sort of establishing what it was that he thought he was going to do and we should do with regard to what he calls arts of acculturation. So he says, I hope this article may show that these arts have often been major means of articulation between mutually acculturating societies, not only in aesthetic, but also in economic, technological, and psychological ways. Nelson himself and many of the people that he influenced in the anthropology of art, as opposed to the anthropology of tourism, followed this idea of acculturation, which, you know, is about, in this case, art sort of reflecting mutual influence, but often lopsided mutual influence between cultures from different places through tourism, right? And as you can imagine, this often means sort of North Atlantic cultures, North America, Europe, perhaps Australia, kind of throw it in there a little bit, maybe Japan, but sort of Western, mainly North Atlantic cultures influencing the way that other people show their culture to tourists, right? As I say, he and people who followed him have been mainly interested in acculturation. I am mainly interested in this other word, articulation. So it is interesting to think about the way that art is influenced in its presentation, its material form, and so forth through this acculturation process. But I want to think about how it can be a tool of communication between people from different backgrounds, right? And again, it tends to be pretty lopsided. It tends to be sort of shaped by the expectation of tourists, which include things like having really colorful culture, or at very least very colorful souvenirs, creating things that are sort of evocative of something traditional as opposed to modern, small enough to put in your suitcase, right? These kinds of things. But behind that sort of surface level of interpretation, there's a lot of communication going on, and that's what I'm interested in here. So there's Ecuador. I'm going to be talking about a couple of communities from Cotopaxi province, which is right here on the western Cordillera of the Andes. If we zoom in a little bit, you might be able to sort of work out from the aerial view here that this is a volcano. It's an inactive but not dormant volcano called Quilotoa, with a lake inside of it. I'm going to be talking about the Community Tourism Center of Quilotoa, which has become a community, but was not a community at all. Nobody lived there at all before tourism. And then I'll be talking a little bit about folks from Tigua, which is where this art form was initially invented. A little bit of background while we have the image here. People, hikers for the most part, who wanted to visit Quilotoa used to get off the bus in Tigua and hike in, right? Which is why this art form developed initially in Tigua, because that was where people first met the tourists who were arriving to go to Quilotoa. But the Pear Center is Sumbawa, and about 25 years ago, the road from Sumbawa to Chupchilan, which is on the other side, just off the image here, passes by Quilotoa. The road was improved. And so people stopped getting off the bus in Tigua, they go all the way to Quilotoa, right? Which means that folks in Tigua have sort of been unintentionally cut out of the tourism business. That's really a story for another day, but it's going to figure in here. So that's what draws tourists in. And like many things, this is very strategically framed shot. There are almost certainly kayaks in the water just off there and probably some hikers just over here that you can't see. So I've cleaned up my own images here a little bit too. But this is what tourists come in for. And here's Quilotoa, the Tourism Community Center and nascent community about 10 years ago when I was doing my dissertation research. So I lived for a year in that building there in the Wamangate compound, which is this whole parcel of land here. Wamangate family has a lot more land than other people do, and I'll mention why here in a moment. But they're not really the wealthiest of the community. That honor goes to the Latacunga family, who's both wealthiest and most indebted at the same time. And here it is from 5 months ago. You can see that the community has grown quite substantially. A lot of the basic sort of adobe buildings have been replaced with cinder block buildings, which are much colder, much less comfortable to inhabit. And it's hard to see here that a lot of these houses are sort of half built. This is a consequence of the COVID pandemic, which basically cut off tourism, or at the very least international tourism, meaning that all of a sudden people didn't have any money and they couldn't finish the construction that they had already started, right? A lot of these people are in the United States now, many of them in Chicago. So some history of the art form here. And in this, we'll be following Grayburn, but I'm not going to really dwell on that too much here. So until the mid-17th century, nobody lived in Quilotoa. In fact, nobody really lived in the entire region around Quilotoa until about the mid-17th century, when Spanish settlement in the lower valleys of the Andean extent there pushed indigenous people up and out. Some were explicitly moved in order to be shepherds on the haciendas that were established. Others were just sort of pushed out of the way and had to find their own place. But indigenous people all went up in altitude. So Quilotoa is about 4,000 meters above sea level, which put it, what, like 500 meters above the highest peak that you can see from Las Vegas. It's way up there. It's like 2.5 miles above sea level. It's windy, it's cold, the soil is not very good, it rains every single day. It's just not a good place to live in unless you need to. But the haciendas sort of brought people, nucleated communities, we can say. From the 1630s until 1908, Quilotoa was on the border of the Sumbawa Hacienda, which was owned by the Augustinian order. So unlike plantations here in North America and the Northern Andes, many of the large land owners were just different elements of the church. That doesn't mean that they were any nicer to the people who lived on the land. From 1908 to 1964, the hacienda was managed by a program called Asistencia Social, in which basically the Ecuadorian government expropriated all of the church properties, but rather than giving that land to the people who were working it, they retained the land and operated it as a way to generate funds for urban social programs, right? So rural social programs never emerged at all. And because the landlords were renting rather than owners, the whole system of exploitation got substantially worse for the people who were subject to the labor sort of system in this case. By the 1990s, following the elimination of the hacienda, this was the poorest region in the entire Ecuadorian highlands. Really, we can probably say it's the poorest part of all of Ecuador. People in the Amazon were earning less money, but they had more reliable livelihoods, right? They didn't really need money in the way that Highlanders did. But in this period from the 60s to the 90s, basically a lot of people who would have preferred to stay close to home and make a living through agriculture and raising sheep in the way that their ancestors did, but for themselves rather than for everybody else. A lot of these people just didn't have an opportunity to do it. They were forced into labor migration to the cities or to the coast. There were essentially no young people or no young able-bodied people in these communities. The social sort of landscape of Sumbawa and neighboring areas was very old people, very young people, and infirm people, with a few people who maybe were in good health but about to leave, right? People who had been injured on the job in construction, who got sick from chemicals on the banana plantations, who came back to recover so that they could leave again, right? This was known as the Jaki Kausai, or Jaki Chishka Kausai, the sad life or the life made miserable, right? Which stands in stark opposition to political slogans of today about the Suma Kausai, buen vivir, the good life, right? People don't look back on their ancestors as ever really having been afforded the possibility of a good life. It was life made sad, right? It wasn't just a sad life or a miserable life. It was life made miserable by the organization of things. So Quilotoa Kisa from Tigua was one of those young people who migrated out. He was born on the Rumichaca Hacienda. Rumichaca is Stone Bridge Hacienda, just next to Sumbawa, and started working in the city at 8 years old, right? He was an able-bodied adult at 8 years old in order to go and support his family by working elsewhere. 8 years is a little bit young, but not really. This was pretty typical. By 1964, he had joined this circular migration of leaving the community to earn money to bring back to his family, being injured on the job or fired for any whim of the employers, and then returning. And so he worked in a sugarcane mill where he got hurt. He worked in a Chinese restaurant where he got burned. He worked in a lumber yard where a full tree trunk was being swung off a truck at one point, and he was just in the way. It hit him directly in the shoulder, nearly killed him, and so he was fired because he couldn't work, right? He went back home in order to try to recover and decided that he had had enough at this point. There was just, there's no possibility of a good life out there. It was the Jaki Kausai. But then he says, then I fell in love. This is in an interview with a colleague of mine, Rudy Colorado Mansfeld. I was saying it in Spanish for some reason. Colorado Mansfeld. And this is a key point in the key turning point in the life stories of many people of his generation. It is at the moment of falling in love and getting married when these young people decide that they can no longer engage in the circular migration where they're risking their body, they're risking their future, because they have people to look after. And so many of these people then return to the communities and try to find a way of making a life, even if it's not a good life, right? Of raising a family, even if they have to struggle in order to do so. And so Julio went to a Satula shaman from the lowland coastal region. For serious issues, for serious health issues, one must always go to a shaman from a different region than one's own in order to get healed. And so he went and he found a shaman who gave him a prophecy. And he said, Julio, you are going to find your work. You'll no longer migrate. Go home, sleep. And when you have the most vivid dream that you've ever had, pay attention, because that's going to be your future. He did go home and did have a dream in which he saw himself painting on the face of the drums that are used for used during the celebration of Corpus Christi in the parish. And it was a vivid dream. He saw, the details of the feather brush that he was using. He saw all of it. And so he woke up and he made that drum. And that is the sort of semi-mythological origin of the art form. Other stuff was going on, right? But this is kind of the story that's told. And so later on, many years later, this was in the 70s, by 2002, he was remembering that experience of visiting the Tzachua shaman. There he is. Oh no, that's a woman. There he is, being cured. So that'll be his wife there, who's waiting patiently as Amaru, the snake, is called forth in order to bring him this prophecy. But as Julio himself tells it, it was really Olga Fish who was in a position to make all of this work. Olga Fish, if you can't tell from the name, is German, was German, but she was living in Quito and running a handicrafts gallery. And so she had been traveling around Ecuador, going to festivals, sort of looking for things that she could purchase and resell through her gallery. And as the story goes, she encountered Julio with his drum and immediately offered to buy it and said, if you can make any more, I'll buy those too. And so Julio gathered up his brothers and they all started painting on drums, and the art form was born. But then Olga Fish said, well, now listen, I have all of these international buyers who can't transport an entire drum. So can you make it smaller? Can you make it square? And can you make the colors a little bit brighter so that people can appreciate your art? Julio and his brothers said yes, and they sort of transformed these drums into the form that we know today. But there are still literal material echoes. The drums are made with untanned sheepskin, as are most of the paintings. Stretched across that wood, it is still essentially a drum. So literal echoes, literal resonance with the origin. But it's notable in this painting by Bernardo, so a family member of Julio's, look at how big Olga Fish is compared to the people that she's helping out, right? That's not a matter of the artist, having a hard time maintaining the perspective or whatever. And it's not that she's standing closer to the viewer, although she is slightly closer. She is just bigger in people's memory than many of the local artists are. And so we start to get this impression that this is kind of people creatively responding to outside pressure, right? Creatively responding to outside pressure. That's how I started my research. It's not where I am now, but in order to kind of get to that transition, I want to tell you here a little bit. So this is a more traditional drum. You can see the danzante from the Corpus Christi Festival, a couple of people accompanying him, and that looks like a horse to me, but it's bull. It's part of the every afternoon celebration of Corpus Christi. And I have a video here from a 1994 film made by a German director that shows. Drums painted to be a representation of the event in which they were used, right? And it is representational. So there's all this decorative stuff around the edges of the drum, but on the face of the drum, it is minimally, at the very least, representative of what's going on. The paintings, early paintings by Julio here, and by other people all continued to focus on that theme. There's a danzante with the drummer, another danzante with another drummer, and you can even see a little bit the way that the face of these drums is decorated. But this is essentially the same thing, just turned into a scene rather than a couple of individual figures. And over the years, the dance has stayed essentially the same. This is a video from 6 or 7 years ago that I took. It's that drum. So it's not very decorated. It's still essentially the same celebration. Over time, the art got more detailed, but it continued to focus on pretty much this same theme, right? So it's not just material echoes of the original drums, it's also representative or pictorial echoes of those original drums. Notice like the Inti father-son sort of looking over things here. This is an important piece of the sort of understanding of what's going on in the festival. Right, the festival of Corpus Christi is, of course, a Catholic festival, but it's also connected to the Inca festival of the sun. And because this is the equator and the sun doesn't really change, it's even more directly connected to the harvest festival, in which, of course, the sun plays a very important role because it is father-son's energy, after all, that makes all of this work. It's a celebration of the exchange of living forces between humans, the environment, and the supernatural. So Jose Guamangate is today my compadre. I sponsored the wedding of his son. This is a much older photo from that documentary from the 1990s. He has a similar story to Julio, but he's a generation younger, and something interesting happens here. So he was born in Ponce, which is right at the foot of Quilotoa. After his, well, actually, slightly before his father's death, but in particular after his father's death, he went down to the coast pretty regularly with onions and potatoes to sell in order to bring some money back home to his mother. As he got a little bit older, he went to go be a porter in Quito, which he hated because of the way that people treated him there. He knew that the coast was more dangerous because he had to work with a machete and avoid poisonous snakes, but the racism of the capital was worse for him. He worked as a bus attendant for a little while until there was a crash that killed the driver of the bus and threw him through the front window. He hid for 2 days in the grass along the side of the road because he was confident, absolutely convinced that the police were going to blame him for the death of the driver, even though he had nothing to do with it. He told me one time, well, I'm Indigeno, which is a Kichwa sort of way of mispronouncing Indigenous in Spanish. He said, well, you know, they're going to blame me, aren't they? So he went back and he fell in love and started a family and became one of the so-called owners of Quilotoa, who initially occupied the land at the rim of the volcano semi-legally, which is to say with the permission of local leaders, but not with deeds. And then in 1996, officially received a deed along with, of course, his wife, Maria Delfina, and some of their neighbors who had moved in received those deeds too. They became the owners by having deeds to the property. But they were very quickly outmaneuvered by people who refer to themselves as the founders of Quilotoa, which was a group of school children who wanted to learn the art that Jose had been able to gain through his marriage into the extended kinship network of the Toaquistas, right? So he married in. This gave him legitimacy to go and learn from one of Julio's sons. But the children of his own community wanted to learn from him. And he said yes to some. He did mentor some of those young people. But when an entire group of school children came and said, we want you to teach so that we can sell art too, he said, no, you just want to be my competitors. why would I do this, right? If you want access to it, you need to get access to the art through these kinship connections. And so these children founded the very first Artisans Association of Quilotoa just after he and Maria Delfina received their deed. And basically, through organizing everybody who had an interest in working in tourism, forced Jose, Maria Delfina, and other young couples who were owners of Quilotoa to join the organization under the leadership of the founders, right? And so this is where that community infrastructure kind of begins. The art over time developed in a number of directions. Here's a wooden tray that has kind of a slice of life feel to it. So it's moved a little bit away from Corpus Christi, but it still has that feel of being sort of traditional or rural culture. Also boxes, wooden boxes like the one that I have here, where I keep all my flash drives. And increasingly other themes. I'm not going to dwell on this because of time, but I want you to notice that there are two different Amazonian themes painted here. This is on the table in one of the handicraft galleries. Each of these themes consists of many different paintings that all represent the same basic set of events. These here come from a different set, and you can tell not only because of the theme, but also because the color balance is a little bit different. The way that these paintings are produced is essentially a sort of production line, assembly line style, where everybody in the family is involved in putting together the frames, stretching the leather across the frame, and then painting the background with a single color, filling in the landscape, filling in the foreground, filling in the figures, and then finally detailing the paintings. The person who signs the painting, the person who gets credit for it, is the person who does the detailing. And very often, in fact, in Quilotoa, that is always a male, the head of the family. In Tigua, it's been sometimes women, but also always head of family. But there are essentially just different versions of the same painting. And that's because these are all done at the same time. It's more efficient to get your colors prepared one time and paint 12 different pieces, because tourists will see this, but then when they take their piece home to their friends, they don't have to say, oh, I have one of 30, right? It's unique. By the time it leaves Ecuador, it's unique. And so this is more efficient. We can come back to that in questions later on if you're interested. Masks. And so when I arrived in Quilotoa for the first time to do research in 2012, the very first time I passed through was 2011. First time I went to do research was 2012. And I was convinced that I was going to prove that these paintings are actually entirely about just responding to the global market, right? Responding to touristic demand for certain colors, for certain themes, because it's all limited to very particular themes. And I thought, all right, I have this great idea. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go around in the market and ask people, hey, why don't you ever paint a bus? Buses are part of everyday life. And everybody said, well, I don't know, it's not part of my dream. I said, yeah, but really, it's about the tourists, right? It's about touristic demand. And they said, no, we just paint what we want. And so about 12 hours after I had this idea and started asking about buses, a young man from the market found me in the hotel where I was staying with this painting of a bus, which is this one that I have right here in front of you. It's not that people can't paint buses. It's just that they don't do it because that's not the story being told. Now, in the moment, I was still thinking, yeah, okay, all right. So I showed you that there's a demand for somebody to paint a bus. And so you're actually still just responding to demand, right? No, actually, no. people are not excluding things from their paintings. They are not leaving things out that would be undesirable to their buyers. They are instead including only those things that tell the story that they want to tell in that particular painting. There are no buses in an agricultural scene because a bus is not part of hoeing a potato field, right? There are no buses in a scene of Corpus Christi because buses get in the way of the dancers, right? It's an actual real world problem. The buses are always in the way. So it's not that you exclude things, it's that you only include the things that belong. And indeed, you must sometimes change or add things in order to tell the story correctly. So this is a photo I took in 2015. I think it's a good photo. I think it's well framed, though I don't really take credit for it because it's one of literally thousands of photos I took. One of them turned out all right. This is the hombre gordo, the fat man, kind of rodeo clown figure who is distracting this bull as it's about to be released. So what will happen momentarily has already started to happen is that a lot of young men will get into the ring and try to snatch this cloth off the back of the bull in order to prove their bravery or virility or general manhood, right? This is mostly people who have something to prove in their manhood, right? These are people who are not fully accepted yet as being men and not boys. And so showing their bravery is one of the ways of sort of convincing at least your peers, if not, the people that you'd rather impress, that you really are a man. When I approached Clever Lapacunga about painting it for me, he was impressed by the photo. In fact, he even asked me for a copy of it and included it in one of his music videos later on. But he changed some things. Now, most obviously, he put everybody in attendance in traditional clothing. He got rid of the trash on the ground to just sort of clean this up and make it a more correct version of the festival that was being displayed here. He also added a dog, which had been a really important part of that year's festival, because this one stray dog kept running into the ring and trying to bite the bulls. And so people remembered it. So this is not just the Corpus Christi bullfight. This is the Corpus Christi bullfight from 2015, right? Because of the inclusion of that dog. He also added two other figures. Well, three figures. One of them is the Waricha, which is a female character danced by a male, whose sort of main characteristic is brazen and unapologetic sexuality. She goes around and sort of grinds on everybody in view of her partner, the hombre gordo. She also steals a lot of things and openly steals them and won't give them back. Sometimes quite expensive stuff. You have to watch your keys. But she wasn't in my photo. In fact, the person dancing that character is just out of the shot here. I looked at other photos from right before. That character is right here. But I had done something wrong by cutting that character out because of the principle of Karuwarmi, male-female, which says that all proper adults are both male and female. Most people achieve this through a marriage of one male and one female. Some people achieve it within their own being of male and female combined. But the hombre gordo is just male. And so he can't exist without his female half. And so she was added in. Also added here in the sky are Taitiinti, Father Son, and the Pachamama, which is sort of like Mother Earth, except that instead of including only environmental or ecological relationships, she also embodies all the relationships between the environment, the supernatural, and the human community. This celebration, this agricultural celebration, is her festival, right? So she was there. I just failed to take a photo. Or maybe not. I later learned that one of the main places where people go to ask for her assistance is at a spring head right up here between those two mountains. So I think actually maybe she is there, but what's notable here is that Taitinti is shining his energy through a bowl of grains that she has around her neck. He's quite literally giving her his energy for the purpose of the community. So as I started to sort of dig into this a little bit more deeply, I first of all consulted my colleague Rudy, who had done a little bit of research in Tigua with the artists by taking their individual characters out of context and asking people to say, who is this? What is this person doing? And the artists were entirely incapable of answering that question because these people are not in context. There's no way of knowing who this is or what he's doing because he's not in a scene, right? Even though it's a copy of something from a scene. But ultimately, this is a matter of storytelling translated into pictorial storytelling, right? So Andean storytelling is organized around characters. These are protagonists with known quantities. Some characters like the wolf or fox and the rabbit are trickster characters, but the wolf is also an idiot. His tricks never work. And the rabbit is very smart. His tricks always work. And so what happens when the wolf and the rabbit meet? They both try to trick each other, and the rabbit always wins every single time. It's cartoon logic, essentially, right? Like, when Sylvester and Tweety meet, Sylvester is always going to win. Doesn't matter the incredible things that Sylvester comes up with, Tweety will always win. And so characters that go together must go together in order to create certain kinds of themes. And stories are organized into episodes. Basically, two characters like Wolf and Rabbit will meet. They'll have their adventure. Rabbit obviously wins, but then you go to a different episode. Sometimes you follow Wolf into his next adventure. Sometimes you follow Rabbit into his next adventure. And depending on who you follow, the next story is probably going to be different. It will also depend on who's part of that scene in the next episode, right? So episodes take their form through the convergence of specific characters. And they follow what I like to call narrative dynamics rather than strict scripts for what is to happen. It's about the kinds of things that happen when certain characters are together in the same place. Extraneous characters and information are not included because they don't contribute to the story. So storylines then consist of these strings of episodes that follow a protagonist into each episode and follow a protagonist out of each episode, but not necessarily the same character or protagonist that was followed in. And a painting is essentially one storytelling episode. Characters create the scene by being co-present. If there's a bus, it's going to have a specific impact on the story. If that's not what you want to tell in your story, you don't put a bus in. Okay? They often move through these distinct temporalities, like the annual festival, ancestral culture, and supernatural sort of permanent presence. Right? They arrive through different movements of time, but it's their co-presence that makes the scene. And the convergence of any particular set of characters defines the theme. So I have actually a lot more to sort of point out, but I'm going to skip here in interest of time to telling you just very briefly how it is that I use this in my research. I work with quite a few artists who began their careers oriented toward tourists, right? Still mostly paint for tourists. But it became very clear to me very quickly that they were very capable of telling other kinds of stories. The reason for the homogeneity of the tourist market is that there are only certain stories that sell. It's not about really catering to tourist interest in colors or folklore or any of that kind of stuff. It's catering to specific stories that tourists want to see. is an ethnographer, a collector of stories, right? And so I started thinking, well, maybe we can actually get people to start exploring these more complex issues by simply giving them the money to do it their way. And so let's see here, we can skip through a lot my exploration of COVID-19. When I went back to Quilotoa with money, just money, and said I wanted to learn about health. That was it. That was the entire prompt, which has created issues with the anonymous reviewers of an article I'm trying to publish about this, because they say, well, what's your methodology? My methodology is I have money and I would like somebody else to do the work of ethnography, and I'm just going to translate it, right? But that is what this is. This is an ethnography told through a particular cultural lens, through a particular medium, which in those ways is absolutely no different than my own ethnography, which is told through a particular medium, which is told through a particular cultural lens that I bring into it, right? And so I have sought then to try to enlist the artists as co-researchers, co-ethnographers, as opposed to illustrators of my work. And this is the challenge that I've had with anonymous reviewers and book editors and other people who insist that something like this is just an illustration of my research. It's not. This is research, right? But you have to know how to read the sea. You have to know these narrative dynamics, which always put male and female together. Kariwagmi, this person is alone. And what's happening? They're unattended, dying in the street. Okay? There is a message here. This person too, female, we know because of the skirt, is unaccompanied. Maybe her male half is just off the screen, but nobody really knows. Because you can't be sure about those urban, educated, non-Indigenous people. Some of them just don't live like proper lives, right? Like that ethnographer who keeps coming through and he still isn't married, even though he's like, there's something wrong with that guy. And there might be something wrong with some of the medical professionals too. Maybe she has a partner and maybe not. We can't really trust this. But people die in the presence of the ambulance. And they get healed in the presence of traditional shamans. All, of course, under the watchful eye of Taidinti and Mama Chimurasa, not me here. So, for time, I'll stop there. And thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say that I can appreciate you kind of flipping it and giving more agency to the artist rather than them only reacting to an industry or a demand or whatever. My question is, because I was thinking about like Walter Little's Mayan Marketplace or whatever, and he suggested that there were things that they intentionally are not for sale.
Yeah.
Right. So some of the storytelling might be selective. And then there are other things that are not for sale. They're not for you, they're for us. Do you see any of that happening with this community, that there are things that are intentionally holding back?
There are things that are, yeah, there are definitely things that are held back. It's not as explicit as the case. It's not as explicit as in the Maya case that Will writes about. There are things that are held back. However, in this art, I think for the most part, no. Okay. And the reason is that it was invented for sale, right? And so there's nothing really about the art that is in any way sort of protected or not for sale. There are perhaps some themes that are just not going to get in there, but I haven't encountered any of those yet. I'm sure that there are things, but I don't know what they would be.
What's interesting too, just a side note, and it's not really a question, is going back to Palenque now, post-COVID is now featured prominently in their street art and their murals is COVID. You see scenes like this now on the sides of buildings. So that's pretty interesting to see that you could, yeah, they're sharing their experiences with this, yeah.
Whenever you were performing your ethnography, was there any, did you ever get any type of details on the type of, like, them conveying emotions? Or they're conveying some type of like, intangible element to their scenes when they're painting them, or?
Yeah.
is it just a scene, like, to what
So,
explore that?
I think. Show you this one here. Yes, the answer is yes, but I think it's not really emotion so much as what we would call affect, right? So it's not quite emotion. It's things like hope or regret, as opposed to direct sadness or happiness or things like that, right? And I have this image here, which is one of the ones on the table by Jose Wangate. This is part of a project we're putting together to do a graphic novel style ethnography, in which he will tell his story of migrating before tourism. And then another artist who's in Chicago now will tell his story of migrating after tourism collapsed following COVID. But Jose tells his story in these sort of episodes. And one of the episodes was his time in Quito as a young man on his very first day working at the market as a porter, and how this white woman hired him to carry far more than he had ever carried before. Quito was very steep, and so he was walking up and down these really steep hills, and she was sort of marching ahead of him without any regard to whether he was able to keep up. But he stumbled at one point and spilled a bunch of fruits and vegetables on the ground. And she didn't like hit him or even yell at him or anything, but she stood stock still and didn't help while he gathered up all of the things that had been spilled to put back in the basket. And so he's actually in the scene twice. Here he's carrying, and here he's trying to get back up on his feet after he's gathered everything up. And you can see that he's crying here through this experience. But I find it notable that the face that he's put on this character is notably old. He was only about 11 years old at the time. This is much closer to who he is today. And so one of the things that we then talked about was the way that this was not only an impactful moment in him understanding anti-Indigenous racism in Ecuador, it's also a kind of a key moment in his memory of how he became the person that he is, right? So he's in the scene both as a young man trying to get back on his feet, and as an old man remembering the pain of that.
So it's like concept of self.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the goal here for his half of that book, right? Is to tell his story of self.
First of all, I always will be impressed on how similar different populations around the Andes are. If I wouldn't know, that will be Peru, and no doubt about it. And we also have similar art production regarding like different scenes. You can come to us. I have a couple examples. But within these similarities, one question that I was having is, I was surprised by the idea that they could have a deed for the lake and volcano and all that land, because at least, and again, doing this comparison, in the Andes in Peru, communal property from the early Spanish colonization is more common. So it is very strange to have one person that belongs to a community have like the deed for a plot of land. So it's that typical, is that the
it was a very particular moment in the history of Zumbao as a parish, where all of the comuna governments got together, and across the entire parish, the leaders decided together that they were going to parcel out communal property in all of the different comunas to recently married young couples in order to try to basically keep young people in the community, right? So Maria Delfina and Jose just had the sort of luck to have been recently married and living on a piece of communal property at the time that this was decided. And so their sort of occupation of the land became formal in a way that people who weren't yet married or, you know, so it was a very, very specific moment. It has happened in other areas of the region as well, but it's not very common. What's actually most interesting here is that it was just a couple of years after that that the Ministry of Environment declared that Quilotoa is part of a natural reserve, the UNESA's natural protected area or something like that. It was in 1996, and it was at essentially the same time that the tourism organization organized itself and declared sort of de facto authority over the property. And so the people of Quilotoa through the organization have been fighting the government since 1996. Every time there's a new minister of environment, the fight starts all over again because the ministry says, no, you can't be here. You can't live inside a park. And the people of Quilotoa say, well, we are here. We have deeds. We have these agreements with other ministries, and good luck getting us out. Right? So it got to the point early on in this conflict where the military, the army was actually dispatched at one point to go and move people out of Quilotoa. But the ministry made the bad strategic choice of also sending one of the sub-ministers out to oversee the process. And so as folks from Quilotoa tell the story, they very politely invited him to stay in a locked building until the army withdrew itself. And he obliged, and the army did indeed withdraw. So it hasn't gone to quite that point in recent years. But every so often, like I say, especially when there's a new minister that comes in, they try to kick everybody out, and local people sort of band together and say no.
Thank you.
Quickly, I'm thinking about, you know, how these pictures are kind of episodic storytelling. It seems like for the tourism industry and how, you know, tourists take it and it's an isolated, unique feature. Do you think the storytelling is more for the kin-based familial production line to kind of tell those stories to their family and not necessarily as much the tourists?
No, I think the answer is no, but it's much more complicated than just no, right? My general sense of things is that by and large, people are not actually conscious of how it is that they organize storytelling, right? They always do it the same way because it's common sense. It's how you tell a story, right? It's that deep culture that nobody ever thinks of. And so when they're telling stories to outsiders, they continue to tell their stories in the same way that they normally would, without any real regard for whether the outsiders are going to be able to understand. And actually, one of the more interesting things, I had so much in here. One of the more interesting examples of this is a painting from 2002 of the ouster of Jamil Mawad, the president, in 2000. So this is the presidential palace in downtown Quito, which has been transported into the indigenous countryside in order to subordinate it or bring it under indigenous power. The National Bank and this religious statue that stands above Quito have also been moved into the indigenous countryside. So government, religion, and economy are all subordinate to indigenous power in this case. But what's interesting is in the actual moment an army colonel, Lucio Gutierrez, who later became president and then also got thrown out of office, is holding the microphone and very much in charge in the way that the press reported it. This is the president of the national level Indigenous organization. I always get his name wrong. Alberto Vargas, I think, who is included in the painting, right? The actual scene from the event is included here. And again, it looks like the army colonel is in charge. There are these lines that all go to the president of the Indigenous organization. And if you do zoom back out, you have an Amazonian shaman blowing his energy up here, a Sanchila shaman from the coast blowing his energy up here. These are both modern day shamans. And then an Inca ancestor who's also blowing his energy down here. This is a scene of Indigenous power. It's two different stories for two different audiences. And you have to know what you're looking at in order to realize just how subversive some of these things are. A lot of that stuff gets into the tourist market.
Yeah,
The tourists buy it without ever realizing that they're purchasing a critique of colonialism.
thank you.
I have a question. What inspired you to develop your ethnography and research on Quilotoa people? Ever been traveling around there? It seems like you have a very deep knowledge of the region and how the people. Did you live there before?
Yeah, and we're past time. Anybody who needs to leave, please feel free to leave here. Yeah, so I did my my undergraduate study abroad in Guatemala and became very interested in art and crafts as an element of what I later came to call cultural articulation, and sort of expected to continue to do my graduate research in Guatemala, but was accepted into a program where there were no experts in that part of Latin America, and instead I was going to be working with Frank Solomon, who is like one of the heroes of Andean ethnography. And since I was interested in this phenomenon instead of a particular place or a particular people, I decided to change up my focus to the Andes. He spent the remainder of all of his research money just taking me with him to Ecuador that following summer when he'd been invited to receive like some sort of medal for ethnohistory or something. I don't even remember exactly what it was, but we were in all of these sort of, governmental spaces and whatever, but then also touring the country to see if there was something I could do as research. We passed through Guangaque and I liked it. It felt good. We had lunch in Quilotoa, thought it was kind of tacky. I intended to do my research in Guangaque, but everybody said nothing is happening in Guangaque. What are you going to study in Guangaque? Nothing happens in Guangaque. And so I went to Quilotoa instead. I still want to go back to Guangaque. I think that when it looks like nothing's happening, that's the thing you really need to study, because there's all kinds of stuff that's happening. But what's happening is what people sort of expect to happen. So how do you learn what people expect? You study a place where nothing. That's not a good dissertation. So.
Thank you.
Do a final round of applause.